Hello, thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to come. I'm going to have to do two things at once. Use the keyboard here and, we got no signal. Oh, it's back. There we go. Okay. So this is one of my, I love this topic. I think it's both fascinating from a historical point of view, and I think there's some wonderful messages that at least it teaches me about the Lord and how He works in our lives, and it gives me a new and a greater appreciation for the prophet Joseph. So we're going to talk about Seer stones and the Book of Mormon. This is a two-part talk. Tonight we'll lay the groundwork. We'll sort of kind of do the backstory, if you will, to the translation of the Book of Mormon. We'll kind of try to understand how Joseph got to that point. And then we'll kind of leave you in suspense, and if you invite me back again, then we'll talk about the second part next time. And hopefully in the meantime you may have questions, or it'll give you a chance to kind of think about some of these ideas, and then you can send us questions beforehand, and we'll try to make sure those get answered if you're interested in that. So, the Gospel Topics essays, you've seen this before, you can find them, and this is the essay that we're doing here tonight. So here's the timeline. So September 1820, Joseph had the first vision. We talked about that last time. In September 1823, he had his experience where Moroni appeared in his bedroom, and he had the 3 visits that night and then one the following morning, and he learned about the plates. At that point, he went and found the plates, but was forbidden to take them. And we'll talk about why that was in a bit. And over the next 4 years, Joseph would go back to the hill every year on that date and get more instruction. And then in January of 1827, Joseph married his wife, Emma. And then later that year, he was permitted to take the plates. So this is a statement by Joseph Knight, one of the very earliest members of the church. He and his family were involved with the restoration of the gospel. His son, Jesse Knight, was important in the settling of Raymond. Raymond was one of Jesse's kids, so you got to take the good with the bad, I guess. So here's the good. Raymond may be the bad, depending on your basketball feelings. But this is what Joseph said later when he was talking about Joseph Smith's reaction to finding the plates. So the Knight family knew that Joseph had been told he was going to get the plates, and so they were some of the first people who learned about it. So he says, after breakfast, Joseph called me into the other room, and he set his foot on the bed and leaned his head on his hand, and he said, "Well, I'm disappointed." "Well," say I am sorry." "Well," says he, "I'm greatly disappointed. It's 10 times better than I expected." Then he went on to tell the length and width and thickness of the plates, and he said, "They appear to be gold." But he seemed to think more of the glasses or the Urim and Thummim than he did of the plates, for he said, "I can see anything. They're marvelous. Now they're written in characters, and I want them translated." So he seemed to think more of the glasses than the plates. So what are the glasses? Well, this is not Joseph's first time using a revelatory instrument, something, a physical object to help with revelation. He was impressed by the Urim and Thummim not because it was the first time he'd ever seen something like that, but because it was better than anything he'd had before. It was like he was, used to driving a Ford Pinto, and now he suddenly had a Mustang. He had upgraded, we might say. So how could he have experience with that before that point? Sorry, I don't have this talk in front of me here, so I'm kind of jumping back and forth between screens. I'll count on my family to yell at me if we're out of sync here. So it's important that we realize that this wasn't the first time. Before the restoration of the gospel, Joseph and his family believed that he had what was called the gift of seeing. This is sometimes called folk magic. folk means the people, especially kind of the common people, the lower classes, the great unwashed, all those kinds of ideas. The high status, the educated, they had their own sorts of magic throughout Western history. If you go back to Queen Elizabeth I's era in England, she had a court astrologer who was also something of a scientist, but he was also a practitioner of what was called Enochian magic. That's John Dee. So John Dee blended the roles in Elizabeth's court of being an astrologer, being a magician, and being a scientist, among other things. So that was the hoity-toity, fancy, educated, highbrow sort of stuff that you would learn out of books, and there would be Greek and Latin incantations and all that sort of thing. Well, there was another kind of what we call quote-unquote magic, and that was what the folk did, what the lower classes did. Joseph did not have books of magic like a high-class magic studier would have. But as you can see what I'm saying, magic can mislead us as a term. So let's see what that really means. Whenever you think about something like this, you should always pay attention to the language that an author is using, because the language that we use will tell you something about the author's attitude toward the subject. For example, if you ever read something that talks about Joe Smith instead of Joseph Smith, you can be very sure you're not reading something that's going to be favorable to Joseph. They're treating him with disrespect or with contempt. Okay? Same thing here. So let's show some examples of that. For example, I might say, I go to church. You are part of a sect or a cult. I have a religion. You're part of a cult. Religion is a positive word, or at least a neutral word. Cult is a almost wholly negative one. I am a patriot. You are a political extremist or zealot. My religion teaches me to invoke the power of God to bless me temporally. You use magic to try to get worldly things. Those are all saying the same thing, essentially. But the way in which we say them reveals something about our attitude, and it will affect how the people listening to us think about what we're saying as well. So in a Western Christian tradition, magic, when you call something magic, that is rarely a compliment. It maybe is occasionally these days if you're into Wicca or something like that, but historically it has certainly not been a compliment. At best, if someone talks about magic, then we either mean they're kind of delusional or that's kind of a little shady. And at worst, we either tie it in with devil worship or we say this person who claims to be doing magic is trying to deceive or exploit people. And so it's important to realize that when historians talk about folk magic and Joseph being involved with folk magic, that is not intended as a negative term. They don't use the term that way. And in fact, there's been a trend to abandoning the term just because it is so loaded. The water became even more muddied back in the 1980s when a man named Mark Hoffman forged a bunch of documents that he passed off as authentic. These documents situated Joseph very deeply in the practice of folk magic, far more deeply than the real evidence suggests, and really shaded how a lot of people look at this. Even though they were discovered to be forgeries, and Hoffman later admitted that they were forgeries and was jailed for the murder of two people that he worried would expose his forgeries. Even given that, a lot of people have not reevaluated their opinions, it seems, in light of that. There's still books going around that were written during the time when these documents were thought to be authentic. And so you'll still run into this sort of thing, even though a lot of the evidence that it was based on is completely forged. You never let the facts get in the way of a good story. The way they found out their forgeries is that someone looked at the ink in his documents under a microscope, and it had what they called crocodile skinning. The ink, when magnified, looked like little crocodile skin, all like a pattern, like a tile pattern or something like that. And only the documents that Hoffman had sold or had been involved in had that. None of the things that they knew that were genuine, authentic things had it. And Hoffman later admitted that he had been aging the documents and it had given it that appearance. So it's now a standard test for document forgery. Okay. So modern scholars of religion have now pretty much come out and said that magic is a fairly useless category because it tells you what I think about it, but it doesn't help you understand the practice or tell you what the people involved in it thought about it. One said, "I see little merit in continuing the use of the term magic in academic discourse. We have better and more precise labels for what had been labeled magic. For any culture I'm familiar with, we can trade places between magical and other generic terms, such as healing, divining, excretive. Excretive is cursing someone, with no loss in understanding or meaning. Indeed, there would be a gain." And this is somebody else. "Modern Western terms for magic function primarily as designations for that which we as a society do not accept, and which has overtones of the supernatural or the demonic, but not of the divine. It's important to stress that this negative connotation has not been grafted onto the notion of magic, but it's inherent in Western terminology virtually from the beginning. It constitutes the essential core of the Western concept of magic." So once you understand that, it then becomes very clear why critics of Joseph Smith are very anxious to apply this label to him, folk magic, because that's a negative thing. And it also explains why church historians, until relatively recently, were very uncomfortable with the term, and why many of us in the church have not heard a lot about that, is because it's an inherently negative thing that's intended to bias us, even though it shouldn't and it needn't. Sorry, I can't see those very well. So if I told you that Joseph and his family practiced quote-unquote magic, or if I went and told them that, they would probably have been somewhat offended. Lucy Macksmith, Joseph's mother, wrote about this after Joseph's death, when even then people were talking about them in these terms. She wrote this, and there's commentary in brackets by a BYU professor who's unfortunately since passed away, William Hamblin. And she says this: "Now I will change my theme for the present from a discussion of farming and building to an account of Joseph's vision of Moroni and the gold plates, which immediately follows this paragraph. But let not my reader suppose that because I shall pursue another topic, that is Joseph's visions instead of their farming undertakings, that we stopped our labor of farming and building and went about trying to win the faculty of abrac, drawing magic circles, or soothsaying to the neglect of all kinds of business, such as farming and building, because the anti-Mormons of the time were claiming that the Smiths were lazy and Joseph only started the church to get rich, which if he did has got to be the stupidest way to get rich of all time. We never in our lives suffered one important interest, farming and building, to swallow up every other obligation, such as religion. But whilst we worked with our hands at farming and building, we endeavored to remember the service of and the welfare of our souls through religion." So useful references and a source for a lot of what I'll tell you today are these things. There's Mark Ashurst McGee. If you're going to read only one thing, that's the thing to read, his master's thesis from 2000. It's a wonderful work. There's other things there that he wrote. And then there's two other, John Gee and that William Hamblin, like I say, the late William Hamblin, Bill. So what did the Smiths believe about all this stuff, about this divine power, about magic, or whatever, however you want to call it? Well, let's look. Well, they considered Joseph to be a seer. Sorry, the computer's really slow here. I guess I need to click there. But when we say seer in this context, we don't mean like prophet, seer, and revelator. That came later. Okay, this is a seer in the sense of what became sometimes called a village seer. They believe Joseph had the vision, the gift of seeing or scrying. Scrying is an old-fashioned word from Middle French that means to see. And so again, you see that contrast between high-status people who had, Latin and books and all that, and low-status people who would use non-Latin and Greek type words to describe what they were doing. Scrying, or seeing, was usually performed by looking into a mirror, a reflective surface, a candle flame, a stone, a pond, anything that would kind of reflect light back they would use. And there were other methods too. Joseph's preferred method was with seer stones, or as skeptics called them, peep stones. Peeping sounds less sophisticated and less reputable than seeing. So vocabulary plays again. And people with this kind of, I don't know if job's the right word, people who did this sort of thing were not uncommon in Joseph's area and time. They're sometimes called the village seers, and we'll call them that to distinguish them from our prophets, seers, and revelators, because that's quite a different concept that comes later. And the seers were generally believed by their neighbors to have the ability to find lost objects, to see things that were hidden, to possibly foretell the future, that sort of thing. And a better term for all this, instead of calling it folk magic, is folk religion. That people didn't believe this or Christianity. They believed both. They saw them as harmonious, just like you might use modern medicine and religion. You believe probably in priesthood blessings, but that doesn't mean that you don't believe that penicillin can cure strep throat. And it was sort of the same thing with Joseph and his neighbors. It was both and, not either or. So prior to his encounter even with Moroni, Joseph had already had experience with several seer stones. And we'll talk about those. We'll show you some pictures. This is Bruce R. McConkie, Mormon Doctrine, very popular book, obviously. Elder McConkie is not known for being a historical or doctrinal radical. He's fairly conservative. And even in here, way back in 1966, he talks about it. He says, in addition to the Nephite interpreters, the prophet also had a seer stone, which was separate and distinct from the Urim and Thummim, and which, speaking loosely, has been called by some a Urim and Thummim. So that's another really important point, which we'll talk about more. People may say, well, why haven't I heard about seer stones? Well, because the early members of the church quite quickly began talking about all such instruments, both the one that Joseph got with the plates and the other seer stones. They began applying the label Urim and Thummim to them. Why did they do that? Well, because those were biblical terms, and they didn't want to be thought of as, rubes or rednecks or low-class people or people who are doing strange and unchristian things. So they picked a label out of the Bible that was sophisticated and, with more dignity to it, you might say. Vocabulary matters. So where did Joseph get these stones? Well, the first stone that he used or encountered was a green stone that was possessed by somebody else who lived locally, a lady named Sally Chase, and she was one of these village seers. She would find things that were lost for people and that kind of thing. And that happened in late 1819 to early 1820. And then the first vision occurred in 1820. So there's an interesting link there that as Joseph begins to discover or to believe that he is able to see things that other people can't, he then has the first vision where he sees something quite dramatic, something that he did not expect. There's even an interesting, one of the accounts of the first vision talk about Joseph describing how he first saw God the Father, and the Father reached out and touched his eyes, and when he touched his eyes, then Joseph could see the Savior. So again, you have this divine element in there where God, I don't know that he said anything, but you can certainly, if you were Joseph, see how you'd go, wow, God touched my eyes and he's made me a seer. He's given me this ability. So Joseph used his neighbor's stone to find his own seer stone. He looked in or on, or he did this scrying, this looking, and he saw the location of another seer stone, which he went and got for himself. So there's a progression here. He borrows the stone so he can see. That's weird. Which proceeds to seeing the Father and the Son. And then the Father touches his eyes, presumably giving him an ability to see that he didn't have before, or magnifying that ability. And then he finds his own stone that he can see with. Orson Pratt would later say that Joseph became acquainted with the spirit of revelation through using the Urim, or the seer stone. Again, you see Orson using the more sophisticated, more respectable term Urim and Thummim instead of seer stone. This is somebody writing about magic or this kind of religious activity, however you want to think about it. And we're going to read it as magic, and then we're going to see how it's very easy to change it into something with a more, what we would call, religious spin on it. So he says divination. So what's divination? Well, it's the same as prophecy. It's seeing and knowing things that aren't evident to regular people. Requires the radical submission of the diviner. Well, that's pretty fancy talk, but it means the humility of the prophet. The prophet has to submit to God. That's the radical submission of the diviner. To the transcendental sources of truth. Well, what's a transcendental source of truth? Well, God would be the chief one, spirits, all that kind of thing. But God would be the greatest transcendental source of truth. Before their lives can be transformed and set straight, before they can be reincorporated harmoniously into the world. In short, divinatory rites follow the pattern of, or in other words, preparing to be a prophet is a type of rite of passage. Then, having learned in the court of the right to offer up to the divine all egocentric resistance. Wow, you can tell this is academic, can't you? What's offer up to the divine all egocentric resistance? That's to submit your will to God. The prophet ends the session reoriented on the world. And, sorry, let's just go back. I clicked too soon. Reoriented onto the world and able to take positive and confident action in it. So you can describe the same experience, the same kinds of things in the two different languages, and we're really talking about the same experience. We're talking about someone who is learning a truth from a supernatural source or from a non-mortal source that has to be purified and prepared in order to do it. So you can think of that in the magical terms that the original's in, or you can think about it in the religious terms that we talked about it. It's the same experience. The same thing happened with Isaiah, if you want a biblical example of this prophet. So this is Isaiah 6, I think, where he's called as a prophet. And he's in the temple, so he's in there, before the Lord, so to speak, and then he gets called as a prophet. And Isaiah's reaction to that is to say, "Woe is me, I'm undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." So he says, I'm not pure, I'm not worthy, I'm not able to do this, I'm not able to bring this message to people because I'm unholy. And what does the Lord do? Well, he takes one of the angels, or the seraphim, unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he took off the altar, and he laid it upon my mouth, and he said, "Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, thy sin is purged." So we would describe that in the church as, the atonement comes into his life, the grace of God, the mercy of God comes to him and forgives him of his sins. Well, someone who's talking in magical terms could talk about how he's just undergone a purification rite so that he can be worthy to be the diviner or the prophet. See the same thing in Enoch in the Pearl of Great Price. There's some interesting parallels here to Joseph Smith's experience. If you look at verse 35, the Lord said, so Enoch said, I don't think I can do this, I'm too young, I'm too inexperienced. And then the Lord spake unto Enoch and said unto him, Anoint thine eyes with clay and wash them, and you shall see. And he did so. And he beheld the spirits that God had created, and he beheld also things which were not visible to the natural eye. And from thenceforth came the saying abroad among the land, A seer hath the Lord raised up unto his people. So you can see the same sort of things, right, with the father touching Joseph's eye. And here you have Enoch, using a physical substance, clay. I mean, clay doesn't forgive sins, does it, or give you magical powers? Well, no, but it's the way that the Lord chose to teach that principle to Enoch. Sorry, I got to change the color on those fonts. So this is Mark Ashurst McGee, church historian and the guy who wrote that master's thesis I told you about. He said, as Joseph had claimed that Jesus told him all current churches were false, he posed a threat to the clergy. So by denouncing Joseph's treasure seeking, we'll talk about that, one of the things Joseph started using the seer stone for was to find buried treasure. And so because Joseph was, at odds with the the priests or the ministers of his area, this was a good way to discredit him, right? He wasn't getting revelation from God. They could say he's using magic to try to get rich. It's a good way to discredit somebody. So, back to the stones. To review, he used his neighbor's green stone, and all he could ever see in that stone was a small stone about a mile away that burned like the sun in his eyes. So he saw his own stone, and Brigham Young later described it as Joseph had told him the story, and went right to the spot and dug and found it. This stone was dark brown, oval in shape, and he ultimately gave this stone to Oliver Cowdery, telling him that he, Joseph, didn't need it anymore because he was so familiar with the spirit of revelation that he no longer needed the help of the stone. And Oliver ultimately gave it to Phineas Young, who was Brigham Young's brother and Oliver's brother-in-law, I believe. And after that, it passed to the church. And I think we have a picture here, if you want to see what it looked like. Maybe. Oh, there we go. So that's it there. Oops. Sorry, this is a really slow computer we're dealing with. We need President Wild's hotshot one. There we go. So slightly smaller than a hen's egg is how it was described. You can see the scale there in centimeters. So you can see how the light glints off it, right? And that would have been the sort of thing that a seer would have wanted, because you want that reflective surface. You kind of focus your eyes on the reflection, be it a mirror or a body of water or something like this. And then there it is with a little pouch that Emma made for Joseph to carry it in. And again, people sometimes say, well, wow, I've never heard about this before. And that's understandable, but it hasn't been hidden. Here's something. To help him with the translation, Joseph found with the gold plates a curious instrument which the ancients called the Urim and Thummim, which consisted of two transparent stones set in a rim of a bow. Joseph also used an egg-shaped brown rock for translating, which is called a seer stone. So where was this hidden? What journal, what big historical journal that you should have been reading? Well, this was actually the Children's Friend from 1974. So they're not trying too hard to hide it if they're printing it in the Friend. There are other uses that we'll see later. So what could Joseph do with the brown stone, or what did he believe he could do anyway, or what did others believe he could do? He was sought out by a Mr. Vanderhoof to find a mare that had been stolen from the stable, and he did so successfully. He used it in the search for buried riches, as we talked about, and we'll talk about it again in a minute. Oh, we'll talk about it right now, I guess. The most famous of those attempts was one with Josiah Stowell, who was a local farmer. And it was at this period that he met and was to court and marry Emma Hale. And Joseph discussed this period in his personal history. In the month of October, I hired with an old gentleman by the name of Josiah Stoll, who lived in Chenango County, state of New York. He'd heard something of a silver mine having been opened by the Spaniards in Harmony, Susquehanna County, state of Pennsylvania, and had, previous to my hiring to him, been digging in order, if possible, to discover the mine. And after I went to live with him, he took me, with the rest of his hands, to dig for the silver mine, at which I continued to work for nearly a month without success in our undertaking. And finally I prevailed with the old gentleman to cease digging after it. Hence arose the very prevalent story of my having been a money digger. So he did do this, but it wasn't as often or as much as later people tried to make it appear, probably. There were other episodes besides this one, but... And what's interesting about this case is that Stowell's son was upset that his father, Josiah Stowell, had hired Joseph to do this, and so his son sued Joseph, charged him with fraud of being a fake. This eventually went to a legal hearing. It wasn't a trial, but it was kind of a preliminary hearing to see if there was enough evidence to presumably go to trial. And Josiah Stowell, I think probably some of what hurt his son's case was that the person who was supposedly defrauded, Josiah Stowell, went up and testified in Joseph's behalf. So any lawyer will tell you that's not a good start. He described how Joseph looked through a stone and described Josiah Stowell's house and outhouses while in Palmyra at Stimson Styles correctly. So Mr. Stowell, I mean, he was nobody's fool. He had heard about Joseph being able to do this, so he went and asked him for a demonstration. And from quite a ways away, Joseph was able to describe what Mr. Stowell's farm and outbuildings looked like. Now, I guess you could say, well, Joseph had probably been there, but why would he have? And in any case, it was enough to convince Mr. Stowell. It was impressive. So if he was impressed, presumably he's not super gullible, because here he is trying to put Joseph to the test, and Joseph passes. So that's why he hires him. And of Joseph's seeing ability, he was asked, do you believe he has, the lawyer asked him, do you believe he has the power? And the man said, do I believe it? No. Which probably looked bad for Joseph for a minute. It's not a matter of belief. I positively know it to be true. So Stowell was convinced to the point of knowledge that Joseph could do what he claimed. And Stowell ended up joining the church in 1830. He was one of the earliest members, and he died in the faith in 1844. And the court had heard that Joseph occasionally was in the habit of looking through the stone to find lost property for about 3 years. What could the stone not do? This is one of my favorite church history stories for a few reasons, but I'm just going to sit here and read this to you. So this is one of Joseph's younger friends from the area talking long after the fact. This guy was not a member of the church. He didn't believe Joseph was a prophet. This is the story he told. He said, we went to Smith's one day. It was a rainy day. We went into the old man's shop. That's Joseph Smith Sr. He was a cooper. So a cooper is someone who makes barrels. It's one of the ways the Smiths made money, is that they made barrels to store things in. And the old man had a shirt on it, and it was the raggediest and dirtiest shirt, and all full of holes. Again, you get a sense of how poor the Smith family really was here. And we got Joseph Smith to look and tell us what color our girl's hair was. And well, you see, by and by, some of them says to Joseph, come, look into futurity, look into the future, and tell us how it is there. And Joseph says, I cannot do that. I cannot look into futurity. I cannot look into anything that is holy. The old man stood there and said, well, I guess he cannot look into my shirt then. So why do I like that story? Well, it's kind of a funny story, but it's also a very casual sort of story. I mean, you can picture this happening. And it's also the sort of story that you would remember and stick in your mind, because there's this kind of pun or joke at the end of it. And so it's very likely that this is, in fact, something that Joseph said. I can't look into something that's holy. And then his father kind of makes a joke out of it. So it's a late remembrance, but it's the sort of thing that would stick in your mind. So it's really interesting. You'd think if you were a fake that claiming things about the future would be one real safe way to do it, right? Nobody can tell you that you're wrong if you go far enough into the future. And by the time you get there, the people you were trying to fool are long gone. So eventually with the brown stone, what was Joseph able to do? He could find lost animals. He could see, even though not generally successfully find, lost treasure or wealth. Later, he developed the ability to find lost or stolen property with it. But he couldn't see into the future, and he couldn't see anything holy. Well, then Joseph takes another step forward in his progression. You remember this? He borrowed the stone, the green stone to see, saw the Father and the Son, found his own stone to see. This stone, the brown stone, led him to a second stone, what's called the white stone. So this is his second white seer stone. And he reported that he had been shown it by the Lord in the brown stone, and he'd gone to get it. It was located 40 feet down below the ground, right in somebody's front garden. This is another one of my favorite church history stories. So to disguise finding it, Joseph got himself hired to dig them a well. That'd be really convenient, wouldn't it, having a well in your front yard? So he knew where this was, and he got himself hired and then dug down until they found it. He kept the stone throughout his life, and it passed to the first presidency ultimately. There are no photos of it that I know of, but you'll see a painting of it in a sec. Willard Chase, he's the brother of Sally Chase. She was the woman with the green stone, the village seer, so there's a family connection here. He was helping dig the well, and he had hired Joseph to dig the well, and he was jealous of the stone and insisted that his story varied depending on what time he told it. Sometimes he claimed that he had found the stone, or that Joseph had found it and kept it, and he shouldn't have been allowed to keep it because it was on Chase's property, and so Joseph should have given it to him because he owned the land. The story changed. At some points, he insists that, it wasn't valuable, I just wanted it as a curiosity. But he was really pretty cheesed he didn't get it. He claimed that, anyway, we did that. And he also at one point said, well, I agreed to lend it to Joseph, but he wasn't supposed to keep it. So the story was pretty hazy. So it's always possible, people have wondered, well, his sister is Sally. Does she want the stone, or does he want to give it to her? Well, why does anybody care? Why is there this dispute about a seer stone? Why do you care if you've got a green stone or a brown stone or a white stone? What does it matter? Here's a picture of the stone. And when you see that compared to the brown one, you have to put yourself into the mindset of these people. And you have to say, okay, well, what is it about that stone that might be more appealing than the brown stone? Well, if you're looking at reflection, maybe it's more useful. Sorry, let's just go back again. So it might be more reflective. But think about how these people thought about things. What was the perfect shape? Well, the perfect shape was a circle, right? It was eternal. It went on forever. It was the same distance from a center point. That's how you draw a circle, is you take a string of a fixed line, you fix one end of the line, and then you draw like that. So the more circular something was, the more perfect it was, or the more powerful. Also, we probably don't have trouble understanding that white or clear could be associated with purity or with power. So again, this is an upgrade for Joseph. Joseph has gone from the brown stone up to a much more circular. It's not entirely circular, but it's more so than the brown stone. And it's white. And then, to jump ahead in the story a bit, you remember he will eventually get the Urim and Thummim that are clear stones. So even more powerful in this way of looking at the world. Here's Martin Harris, where he talks about Joseph using the stone. He said, I was at the house of his father in Manchester, 2 miles south of Palmyra village, and I was picking my teeth with a pin. And the pin caught in my teeth, dropped from my fingers into the shavings and the straw. You get the sense this might have been the same Cooper's area, the building where Joseph Sr. made barrels. I jumped from the bars and looked for it. Joseph and Northrop Sweet also did the same. We couldn't find it. Then I took Joseph on surprise, and I said to him, take your stone. I had never seen it, and I didn't know that he had it. He had it in his pocket. He took it and placed it in his hat, the old white hat, and placed his face in his hat. I watched him closely to see that he didn't look to one side. He reached out his hand beyond me on the right, and he moved a little stick, and there I saw the pin, which he picked up and gave to me. I know he did not look out of the hat until he had picked up the pin. So again, people sometimes portray Martin Harris as this very gullible, very credulous old farmer who, Joseph hoodwinked to get him to mortgages for him and pay for the Book of Mormon. But Martin was always doing this. He was always putting Joseph, not always, I shouldn't say always. He frequently did this. He did this on more than one occasion, doing little tests to see if Joseph was fooling him. And Joseph always passed. That's why partly why he supported him, is because he had pretty good evidence that Joseph was doing what he claimed to be able to do. There's another story later, which we'll look at next week, when Martin Harris is helping Joseph translate the Book of Mormon. They would sometimes, when they got tired, go down and throw rocks in the river. And while they were doing this, Martin found a rock that looked like Joseph's brown seer stone that he was using to translate with. And so Martin switched the stones. He swapped them. And then, without telling Joseph. And then Joseph went down to translate, and then he said, Martin, there's something wrong. It's as black as Egypt here. I can't see anything, essentially. And Martin then confessed what he had done. So again, you could say, well, Joseph saw him switch it and decided to fool him. Yeah, there's always another explanation. But again, Martin was convinced. So once Joseph had the white stone, he began to do other things with it that he couldn't do with the brown stone. He began to give what were called blessings and prophecies. And he began, so he could begin to see the future. He could begin to see these things that he said before he couldn't see, the future and things that were holy. During one of their interviews, Moroni told Joseph that he had to bring someone with him to collect the plates. And at first it was going to be Joseph's brother Alvin, and then Alvin died, and Joseph didn't know what to do, and the angel told him to look in his stone, and he would see the person who was to come with him in the future, and it was Emma Hale. He saw Emma doing it. And so let's compare the stones. So the brown stone is dark and oval, but it's a flat area, and it's kind of shiny. The white stone is white, it's more perfectly circular, and it's a little bit translucent. They can find wealth and treasure and animals with them. He couldn't initially find stolen property, but he gained the ability. Could he see the future? No, but he could with the white stone, for both himself and others. And could he see holy things? No, with the brown, and yes, with the white. So Moroni used the stone to show Joseph the location of the plates, and showed him that he was to bring Emma. Joseph also used the stone. He hid the plates often, and would use the stone to watch over them, to monitor them. Early closed-circuit TV, I suppose. And this stone would later play a role in the translation, but we'll talk about that next time. So, let's return to where we started. After breakfast, Joseph called me into the other room, set his foot on the bed, leaned his head on his hand, and said, "Well, I'm disappointed." Again, I love this story because, again, you get Joseph's character, right? He's talking about something really serious here, really amazing, but he's also going to play a little joke on his friend. His friend knows that he's been really excited about these plates and getting them, and so he's going in and he's going to make his friend think that, that it didn't work out, and then he kind of springs the joke on him. So I think you get a good look at Joseph's character here. "Well," says he, "I'm greatly disappointed. It's 10 times better than I expected." He went on to describe the plates, but he seemed to think more of the glasses or the Urim and Thummim than he did of the plates, for he said, "I can see anything. They are marvelous." So hold on, you may be saying. How did all this work? Well, even to ask that question tells you that that's a very modern 21st century question to ask. They probably wouldn't have asked that question. But let's ask it and see what we get. People in Joseph's day or especially the common people who weren't scientists or that sort of thing, were usually less interested in how something worked, because they quite frankly didn't understand how most things in the world worked. They just accepted that it worked. For example, you don't have to know anything about chemistry or metallurgy or anything like that to be a good village blacksmith. You just have to learn what works and to do it. You don't need to know about atoms and all that. I mean, they didn't know about any of that, and they didn't need to. They didn't need that kind of information. So the one thing you did need is you needed to have the gift for this. Not everybody could do it. And Joseph and his family sincerely believed that he could. So we label this, or we sometimes label this as magic, but another way to look at it would be what we might call proto-science or early science. Another method of getting information or finding things was a divining rod. You've probably all seen people doing that. It's got a stick with a fork in it, and the fork bobs when you find the water or whatever it is. That goes back to this kind of practice as well. It's interesting, there's an article that was published in 1825, and it said, "The rod closely resembles the dip of a magnetic needle when traversing a bed or ore." So for this writer, there wasn't a whole lot of difference probably between, they didn't understand magnetism. They didn't know how magnets worked. Mormons don't even know how magnets work, if you can believe the internet. But magnets are not magical. They're not some superpowered, power of the devil or of God. They work. We don't know how they work, but they work, and they can show you true north. So using a divining rod was, for this author anyway, somewhat similar. It would behave in the same way. We don't know why, but we know, or we think we know, it works. Mark Askershgi, this is going back to 1857, so this is well after people are in Utah, but this is an older person, says, "I had the knowledge of the science of seer stones, and I was somewhat gifted in knowing one when I saw it." So here he even calls it a science, and they used science in a little bit different way than we did. It tended to mean just knowledge. That's what science means, is knowledge. So I had the knowledge of it. In the American Journal of Science and the Arts, it said, "The divining rod is influenced by ore." And if you go all the way back to 1636, Someone wrote, "The rod guided me to the orifice," that's the opening, "of a lead mine. The rod is of kin to the lodestone," which is the magnet, "drawing iron to it by a secret virtue, inbred by nature, and not by any conjuration, as some have fondly imagined." So this person here is saying, divining rods aren't magic. They're just nature. They're just what we would call science. We don't know how it works. It's got some secret virtue, but it works. And really, if you were trying to find a lead mine, you wouldn't care how it works. You'd just care that you found the mine. Sorry, this computer. I did test all this. So he had lots of successes. We talked about finding the stone, digging wells, seeing Mr. Stoll's homestead, finding the pin, a vision of a judge's lost wallet. That's a fun story too. The judge had been riding his horse. Judges tended to, they rode the circuit, it was called. So you'd ride from little town to little town, and they'd store up any legal cases so you could do them, and then you'd go on to the next town. Well, the judge was riding his horse and got to the area Joseph was in and found that he'd lost his wallet. And he heard that Joseph could find things, so he asked Joseph to look, and Joseph told him where it was. It was by a stone next to a stream that the horse had presumably jumped over, and the judge went and found it. He also found, there's stories told him about a feather that was hidden, something that looked like ore, salt, wheat from a wagon. There's a case of him reading a book without being able to see it. Someone having the book and Joseph reading off the page, which again was probably significant for later translating the Book of Mormon, because it's the same kind of activity. So why would did I skip one? There's one more. Not our day. One more time. I don't know how the computer works, I just know it does. And he described the money that someone had lost 15 years earlier. And again, the majority of these stories are told by people who aren't members of the church. They're people in Joseph's area remembering later, which is interesting. So, now the question, and probably the key question, the question that most members of the church ask themselves is, why would the Lord work this way? Well, I'm not going to presume to tell you why the Lord does things the way he does. I'm going to give you some ideas to think about, but this isn't necessarily why. But I think it's perhaps one of the reasons. There are two separate questions that you have to think about with Joseph Smith in this context. Why should his neighbors and acquaintances believe that he was a prophet and could translate ancient records? Why on earth should anyone even give that the least second's hesitation of, why would you even start to believe that? He had no education. His wife Emma said he couldn't dictate a coherent or well-worded letter, and she probably knew because they had dated, and one of the ways you dated is that you sent little messages to your beloved, and so Emma probably knew very well that Joseph was not a terribly learned man. So why should they believe that? Why should they even entertain it? More importantly, and a question I don't think we think about enough, is why should Joseph believe it? I mean, we tend to think of it as, oh yeah, the Lord told him to do this and he just went and did it. But it wasn't that simple. We'll see more of that next time. But why should Joseph, the thing that would worry me if I had these kind of experiences is I might start to say to myself, am I crazy? Am I beginning to lose my mind? Why am I having these experiences? So for other people, it was clear to them that Joseph had some type of ability or perception that went beyond the typical. If Joseph could find a pin for Martin Harris, or he could see Stoll's outbuildings from miles away, or if he could read a book without it being open in front of him, then it's not quite as implausible to think that he could read another book and translate it. For Joseph, though, you got to remember, everybody in the church, including Joseph of the first generation, was a convert. They didn't grow up in the church. They didn't grow up with the knowledge that we have. And they learned gradually, even once the church was restored. And so they all came in with their own religious ideas and their own ideas about the world. And you can see Joseph through this process, as I've tried to trace out for you, you can see Joseph kind of stretching himself, growing, becoming more capable. He starts out with what we might call really telestial, worldly things, looking for buried treasure, finding an object that's lost. Those might be good things or useful things, but they're very worldly, very telestial. And remember, he says, I can't look into the future and I can't look into things that are holy. But he gets a better stone, a stronger stone, a stone that's, the white stone that's partly translucent, that's more circular. And with that stone, he's able to do more. He does what we might call terrestrial things, kind of the next level up. He can find lost objects, things that used to belong to you but don't, that you've mislaid. And he could see into the future. He could see people's spouses or that kind of thing. And then he ultimately got the Urim and Thummim, the Nephite stones, which were marvelous, that he could see anything with them. Finally then, Moroni and the Lord, there we go, sorry. So the stone led him to buried plates, which was a buried treasure. And remember, he tells the story, he's very frank about it in the book. As soon as he sees the plates, what's the first thing he thinks? The first thing he thinks is, wow, look at all that gold. If I sold those, my family's money worries would be over. And then he goes to take the plates and he finds they're not there. They're back in the hole. And so he tries this a few times and it doesn't work. And he finally cries out, why can't I get the record? And then Moroni appears and says, because you haven't kept the commandments of the Lord. So Moroni is trying to kind of wean or urge Joseph along, right? He starts out using the stone for his own benefit, you might say, or at least for the benefit of people around him, finding lost things, finding money, etc. And now Joseph has found a buried treasure, all right, but it's not the kind of treasure that he's used to looking for. It's a spiritual treasure. It's a testimony of Jesus Christ. And so he's got to get his head around this. He's got to start to train himself, to train his way of thinking, so that he no longer looks at these gifts, these abilities, in the same way. The year before he's allowed to get the plates, Moroni tells him, come back in a year, but if you're not ready, then the Lord will pick someone else and you won't have the gift of seeing anymore. So there's a bit of a deadline here. Joseph is expected to move along. Already talked about that. So Joseph began the whole process with an understanding or a belief or a conviction that he could see things and perceive things that not everybody could. And the Lord was able to use that conviction to lead him along from one step to the other. You remember we talked about when he finished the translation of the Book of Mormon, he gave the stone to Oliver Cowdery, and he said, I don't need this anymore because I've become so familiar with the spirit of revelation that I don't need it. The Lord had, in a sense, kind of weaned him off it. It's like he put training wheels on him and then finally could take the training wheels off. If you or I had this experience, the Lord, we've got enough of familiarity with the idea of revelation, we might not need the training wheels. But Joseph did. Doesn't want to go forward. It's going to jump a whole bunch now. Sorry. So the Lord meets us where we are, and that to me is the best part of the story. The Lord said this to at the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants. He said, I am God, and I have spoken it. These commandments are of me, and were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding. And inasmuch as they erred, it might be made known. Inasmuch as they sought wisdom, they might be instructed. And inasmuch as they sinned, they might be chastened, that they might repent. And inasmuch as they were humble, they might be made strong, and blessed from on high, and receive knowledge from time to time. So he says, we tend to be quite arrogant. We present-day 21st century people. We tend to think we've got it all figured out, that we've got, our science, we know how the world works. But I would bet that what we know about how the world works is probably closer to Joseph than it is closer to what God knows. God knows far, far more than any of us. And if God was to sit and give us the whole thing, everything he knows, everything he understands, well, we wouldn't be able to comprehend it. We wouldn't be able to frame it into our limited minds. So the Lord always has to do this. The Lord always, to a degree, has to dumb things down for us. When my kids were young, 3 and 4, and they would ask why the sky was blue, I would tell them it's because of Rayleigh scattering. Rayleigh scattering is where the air molecules, especially in the nitrogen bonds, scatter blue light. They didn't know what molecules were. They didn't know what chemical bonds were. They don't know what wavelengths of light are. So I'd have to you have to dumb it down. You have to simplify it for them. Because that's the only way to answer their question. You say, the air scatters the blue light, spreads the blue light out. Well, that's true, but it's not the whole story. It's not even close to the whole story. So this is how the Lord works with us. It's how he worked with Joseph Smith. It's how he worked with the early saints. And it's how he worked with you and me. And it's a good example of how kind the Lord is. One of the interesting things that I've found is the smartest people that I've ever known, the people who know the most, the people who are the most brilliant, those people, almost all, have been very kind to other people and have been very good at explaining the things they understood at a level that everybody could understand. The people that you should be skeptical about, the people that are trying to make themselves look good, they're the ones who throw in all the fancy words and, try to make themselves look oh so bright. The really smart people, the really gifted people, in my experience, are incredibly kind and incredibly nice. They don't have to prove they're smart. They know it, and they're used to it. And they're not trying to impress anybody. They're just trying to help other people understand. And I think the Lord is very much like that. He does not talk down to us. He does not chastise us for the things we can't understand. He starts where we are, and he gives us little bit by little bit, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little, which is what he did with Joseph. Think about it this way. Suppose you had to have a perfectly accurate idea about God's nature before God would speak to you. Well, what that would mean, from our point of view anyway, is that hardly any other Christian in the entire world would get an answer to their prayer because they believe that God is a spirit without body parts and passions. And we know that he's not, that he has a physical form. How would it be if the Lord required you to have all the right beliefs, have everything lined up before he was willing to talk to you or willing to help you out? Well, we'd all be in very deep trouble. And, the success of the missionary program is proof that he doesn't, that he takes people who know very little and he answers their prayers. And as he answers their prayers, he teaches them one thing after another, and they learn more and more and more, if they're willing to learn more. So that is my message to you. That's true of church history. It's true of doctrinal things that might trouble you. It's true of all sorts of things. We can never grasp all the truth. We can never get all the answers God has to give us, but he always has more to give us if we are humble, if we will act on the truth that we do know, if we will learn the lessons that he's trying to teach us. And he'll eventually wean us away from the things that aren't true, and he'll ease us into the things that are, just like he did to Joseph Smith. I leave you that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you so very much, Brother Smith, for coming tonight and for that wonderful presentation. Lots to think about. What we'll do as far as closing the meeting is we'll leave it to you and your family home evening groups, wherever you are, to have a discussion and close your own family home evening. And again, we thank you, Brother Smith, for your time and for your energy and for all the things that you've done for us as a stake. Just as a side note, as we close, we're recording all of the presentations this year. We didn't last year, but we're recording all of them this year. and they will be available or are available or will shortly be available, hopefully, on a website, the Lethbridge or the YSA Stake website, which is lethbridgeySastake.com. So if anyone wants to review and listen to this again, please feel free to do that.
I'll just jump in and say that I've also put them, if this will work. I've put the slides, if you want the slides, because there's references and stuff on the slides. If this will let me, oops, I don't know what's happened there, but the link is there. I don't know if you can read it. It's tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/gospel topics. That takes you to a shared Dropbox folder that has all the slideshows that we've done.
Okay. Okay. Thank you again for coming tonight, and we'll see you again next month, I believe. Thanks.